Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Atom, or A Touch of Multiplatform. My name is Justin, and I wear a lot of hats at Touchlab. Today, Pamela and I will be talking with Ritesh Gupta. But before we introduce him, I'd like to confess that early in my career, I thought software development was purely logical and mathematical. Turns out that communication, empathy, and ethics, among so many other soft skills, as people say, are just as important and sometimes more important. Pamela, what did you believe early in your career but think differently about now?
Hi, folks. I'm Pamela from JetBrains. I'm a developer advocate there. And I believe that design patterns was just the best thing ever. I used it everywhere, everywhere. With us today, we've got Ritesh Gupta. Um, Ritesh, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us about your early career mistake?
Sure. Thank you, team. Hi, everyone. I'm Ritesh from India. I work with a leading ODD platform as a staff iOS engineer. So I've been doing iOS for a couple of years. And yeah, one thing which I believe earlier and I think differently about now is abstractions. Earlier I used to think, like have n number of abstractions, or trying to make things more generic. But now I think, over the years of time, I've learned the hard way that abstraction also comes with a cost. So it's better to not overcomplicate your code and maybe sometimes keep things simple. So yeah.
Mhm. Absolutely. Ritesh, can you tell us a little bit about how you got started becoming a KMP developer? Um,
Sure. So I think somewhere around 2019, I think maybe in the early summers, I think I stumbled upon a Medium article or something, which, was talking about sharing code base and was comparing KMP with, at the time, Flutter and React Native. And that caught my eye that, something which I could try. Because even though I primarily been an iOS developer, but I have also shipped a bit of Android apps in my part time. So I was familiar with the Kotlin ecosystem a bit, or Android Studio a bit. So I thought, let's give this a shot and let's see how things turn out, because Kotlin is something which was familiar to me as well, before. And also the promise of the fact that KMP only shares non-UI code. Now Compose for iOS changes things, but earlier the promise was that you can only share your non-UI code, the business logic, across all the platform, in Kotlin. So that promise was something which I was excited to try. And then I just gave myself a side project to work on, and I think and I think at that time Swift UI was also around the corner by Apple. So I wanted a project where I could try both Swift UI and KMP together and see how they fit together, how they work, and all. And yeah, that's how I got into KMP, and then finally I was able to pitch in the idea to my company at that time, who also got excited and built a POC for them and went on, I think, working with multiple clients using KMP.
Very cool. We love having iOS developers on here, or at least background in iOS, because we get a different perspective on things, and we'll get a little more into that a little bit later. But right now, I want to know, in your descriptions of your bio when you're speaking at conferences and also for this show, you say that you're working on a leading OTT platform, but
Yeah.
I don't know what OTT means. What is that? And can you give some examples?
Sure. So OTT is just an acronym for over the top. It's just a fancy name for saying that I work for a streaming company. So OTT is nothing but streaming content over internet. So the old days we were able to stream content over cable wires, but now we stream content over internet. So for example, Prime, Hulu, Netflix, Disney Plus, these are all our OTT companies, and I work for one of them.
Oh, cool.
so you have about 10 years of experience doing iOS. So you've seen probably a lot of really great code and perhaps not such great code. What are your most favorite and least favorite architectural patterns?
So I think if if I had to answer this question, let's say 5 years back, I would have really picked, few patterns which are my favorite and few patterns which I didn't like. But now I think I would say that every pattern has a place. Like for example, we all have a little not so good relation with singleton pattern or with MVC pattern, but I think even they have a use case now. So I do feel that I think every pattern deserves a place as well in the community, and they all have a use case that might be useful for your particular thing. Of course, I think every pattern comes with a trade-off. So I think what really matters is to know the trade-off of when to use a particular pattern. But yes, some patterns are easy to misuse as well, like singletons and MVCs, where your singleton can be in your because it's very easy to make them, right? So you can just throw a singleton everywhere in the app, and suddenly you can't inject things, and then you can't test things as well. And same thing with MVC as well, where your controllers or your activities could really become very bloated class. But I think if you model things in a more in a correct way, then even these patterns have a place, and they also have a use case. So I think now I would say that every pattern has a fit in the code that we write. But yes, some patterns are a little easier to misuse, and some patterns are a little difficult to misuse.
Is there a particular pattern that works really well with KMP, in your opinion?
I think that's an opinionated one, but I think so. When I worked with KMP before, or the first time, I was using MVVM for my iOS projects. So my initial go-to pattern was MVVM at that time. Sorry. So I tried that, and the view model that we have in Android right now, the one which the Google gives us. So the idea was to keep it separate. So that view model was only with Android, but we were making view models for both the platforms separately, and then just share the view models with the both the platforms. And then the platform was just writing, let's say, their UI code, and then they were listening for the events via the view models, and then adapting to them. So yeah, like that worked for me, I think, for multiple apps that I work with. But of course there are other patterns as well which I have seen other working as well, like MVI per se, where you can really take your shared logic up till the reducer level as well, or to the state level as well, and then you can just expose an observable or a listener to your view class, which can listen to a state and then wrap itself. So I think a mix of both the worlds could also be useful. But yeah, I think in my experience, I've kind of what has MVM has been working for me, so that's my go-to pattern with KMP.
Yes, I think it's quite a go-to pattern for most people using KMP and Compose, Jetpack Compose, or Compose Multiplatform as MVVM. Although I have seen your wife, Garima, wrote a very interesting article or series of articles not too long ago about how to use Jetpack Compose with MVI, the MVI pattern. So there's a little bit of background knowledge there as well.
Yeah, I think we had endless debates over, like me and Garima, we debate a lot about these patterns and what fits and what not. So yeah, like, and we have spent a lot of or wasted a lot of time on these discussions. But yeah, like these are always fun as well. And yeah.
No debates. I like it.
That's cool. Talking about these patterns and how they affect like going up to the view model or even sharing more than that. When people are coming from non-KMP projects, native projects, they usually have separate repos for iOS and Android. It makes sense because they're different teams. And when you start sharing code, people start thinking about, should we still have these multi-repos or mono-repos? And you've thought a lot about this. What are some things people should consider when they're choosing as they either develop into KMP or they're starting a new project that's fully KMP?
Sure. Yeah, that's it's an interesting one. So I think again, it might be just my opinion, but I think when you're working with a startup where you know that your product needs a lot of iteration, and you really need to move fast, and it needs a lot of changes, and and you don't have initially you don't want to focus too much on CI/CD or on test cases or on or on managing too many teams. I think when your team is very small and you really want to ship an app really fast, I think in those cases a monorepo would be a better option to go, because it really reduces the overhead of maintaining multiple repos and how they communicate to each other, how do you make artifacts, because the moment you move from mono to multi-repo, there are n number of questions that comes, which is unanswered right now. I mean, at least at that time. And I think now the community is solving them piece by piece. But there are a lot of challenges to a multi-repo architecture, which is not existent in monorepo, where Android might have a better support. But when it comes to iOS, I think we do lack a lot of support for distribution of your Kotlin code, which an iOS team can simply consume. So there are a lot of steps involved in that. So in my opinion, if you want to really move fast, and don't have too much thing to worry about right now, you have a small team size, go with a monorepo. But you're working with a already, as you mentioned, you already have a team, you already have distributed team, you already have distributed repos. In that case, I think multi-repo still makes sense, and you can still try to adapt to it, and then see how slowly you can fit in KMP in your entire pipeline of end-to-end pipeline.
So, in your experience, what was really difficult about the multi-platform, the multi-repo scenario, but setting up those distributions for Android and iOS? What was difficult for you there?
So Android has always been the easier part of the problem to solve. So we had Maven, we had GitHub packages. It was easy to hook them up and distribute the packages. But at that time, CocoaPods was not natively supported by JetBrains or by KMP itself. But all we had was one Gradle method which was able to export the framework for us, from Kotlin to a iOS framework. At that time, we also did not have support for making a fat framework out of the box. So we had to also write some extra code, some extra scripts to make fat framework work as well. Now, what is the fat framework? Fat framework concept comes from iOS, where if you have multiple platforms to support, like watchOS, ARM architecture, Intel architecture, you want to combine all of that into one framework as well, so that you can run that framework in any platform. And then that's where the fat framework came into picture, which was then overtaken by something called XC framework in iOS. XC framework is a modern way of wrapping a multi-architecture code into one for iOS. Now, all these problems were not solved at that time for iOS. Also, how do you make sure that, let's talk about, once you write the Kotlin code, now what's a Gradle plugin which converts that Kotlin code into a generic fat framework? That's step one. So that was also not properly solved, or was challenging at that time. Once you have that framework, now where do you host the framework? You would like to host it somewhere. That was also a part of the problem. But let's say you also figured out how to host it. Now, how do you fetch it, over the internet in your iOS app? That was problem number 3. And once you're able to download it, how do you configure your CocoaPods or your SPM now to understand what this framework is, and how does it inject to your code? So that's problem 4. So there were a couple of problems, throughout this pipeline, which was not existing for monorepo, but was there for multi-repo architecture. So I had to spend endless nights on Kotlin Slack groups. Touchlab was very helpful at the time as well. Had a lot of conversation with the team. But yeah, I think skimming through multiple GitHub projects, their issues, and trying some things, which might work, might not work. So a lot of beta trials, a lot of experimentation that went into, and finally was able to develop one pipeline, which was able to, where we were able to integrate with CocoaPods, by just running CocoaPods function called pod install. And when you run pod install, we wrote a pre-install hook, which was able to download the artifact from GitHub and then hook it up in the project and give it to the iOS app. So that was one approach that we could have done. So these were the multiple challenges. How does once you have written the Kotlin code, how do you ship this Kotlin code to a multi-repo iOS project? Right? So that transfer of Kotlin code to iOS, I think, was the biggest challenging piece, which we experienced with a multi-repo architecture.
I'm almost out of breath hearing all those challenges from back then. Do you think it's been getting easier? Like if someone's coming into it now?
Oh yes, definitely. I think now we have a native cookerpod support. Okay, I'm not sure if native is the right word, but I think we have a good cookerpod support now. I'm sure I think TouchLab is funding that. I think to a large extent. So now we have cookerpod plugins which have these Gradle functions for us, which can directly convert a Kotlin code to a XT framework file for us. And plus we have more tools by TouchLab that which for example, camp kit was not there at that time, but now we have a camp kit which can bootstrap your project, right? So I think we have a lot of more tools now which the community has built up, and those really make things easier for us to ship these kind of things, which were not possible at that time. But I would say still, like, it's not uh, there's still a little scope of how we can improve things in this space. And yeah, I mean, and wherever things are not solved, I think that's where open source come into picture. So yeah, we'd love to see what open source can do this.
Yeah, community continuing to grow, more open source projects, Kotlin Foundation helping things out. There's a lot going on now that just didn't exist when you were getting started, that people getting started now are going to have a little bit of an easier time. I wanted to go now to your iOS experience. So you started as an iOS developer. You've been doing that for 10 years or more. When we're talking to iOS developers and businesses that want to bring their iOS teams into KMP, we usually get some hesitation around that, some skepticism. What would you say to other iOS developers who might be hesitant to give Kotlin Multiplatform a try?
I think in short, trust your Android team, trust your KMP team. They know that that sharing code, I think is the future. But yeah, like apart from that, what worked for me while, because I had the same problem. When I pitched this idea to my team, the iOS team was hesitant to try it out as well, and they were and it's a fair enough call because it's not a home ground for them, right? So it's not easy for them to bring something from outside and use it and and be comfortable with that. So I think what really helped us was that initially, like we didn't ask our iOS team to take the or we didn't ask the iOS team to, let's say, get to the bandwagon of understanding what KMT is. We just asked them that, hey, we are introducing a dependency for you. It's like any other third-party SDK. It's just that right now the third-party SDK is not too powerful. It can not just do API calls, but it can also modify business logic as well. So don't think like we are introducing something new. Just think of it like a third-party SDK that we internally build ourselves. Don't worry about how it was built. Don't worry about how things work right now, but just consume it and keep on building and shipping the products, right? So initially, me and the Android team, we took the heavy lifting of making sure that everything worked end to end without allowing or without telling our iOS team that how things work really under the hood. But once they started seeing the benefits of sharing code base, once they started understanding that, hey, this really is saving time. This is not just time, but saving efforts as well, saving the test time, saving your code time as well. Then we started adopting and giving them sessions at how KMP works on the hood. And then slowly we adopted or brought in more iOS devs one by one who could also contribute to KMP. So we didn't let them initially contribute it because we didn't want them to be afraid of this or have more hesitancy towards it, but rather than we give them an overview of how things work, and then slowly we onboarded them, and finally they started contributing as well, and they all loved Kotlin as well because it's pretty similar to Swift in a lot of ways.
Yes.
So that helps the case as well. So I think so that was the journey of adopting it from the iOS perspective.
That's a great perspective. I've also heard some iOS developers love parts of their platform, what they're doing, and they hate other parts. Core data sometimes comes up, and I've been thinking, like, is that some kind of blog post we should write? Like, hey, you don't need to write core data anymore because the KMP developers who are creating this sort of third-party internal dependency can take over that part of the stack? Are there things like that iOS developers may be like, oh, I'm happy to not have to deal with that anymore?
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, that's a tricky one. Like, I mean, yes, you're spot on to the fact that iOS community has a bit more negative opinion about core data, because like people, if you want to have persistence layer in your app, the core data is supposed to be a little heavy, for your use case. And most companies, they fall back to simply saving JSON files and then reading them and then saving them again. But personally, I always had a different opinion about core data. But okay, that will be a segue, I guess. So let's not go there. But personally, I always enjoyed working with core data, because once you know the stack, how it works, I think it's a really powerful tool. But yes, like, but yes, I think if we say this, if we pitch to an iOS team that, hey, you don't have to use core data, but rather you will use SQLite or some SQL version of it, which is coming by KMP, maybe they might get more comfortable, or maybe they will be relieved as well that they don't have to worry about that persistence anymore. So I think, yeah, I mean, I think it depends on your team as well, like how passionate they are towards certain kind of a code base. So if they are relieved enough, then I think it'll work. Definitely it'll be easier for us. It'll be a pro in the pro column, right? But if somebody is very passionate about, let's say, realm or some codable persistence, then they might fight that, hey, we already have a sophisticated caching mechanism, and why would I onboard something which is experimental or which we haven't tried yet? So yeah, so I think a lot depends on the team, how it can, but so it can go either way as well.
Mhm. So, do you think it's necessary? So, in sort of the flip side, we have the Android developers, and maybe do you think it's necessary for them to learn some iOS and Swift stuff to help effectively write that shared code, that KMP shared code?
Absolutely. I think it's a very, it'll be a good habit
Mm.
for anybody who's onboarding KMP to their team. I think even if you don't involve directly the iOS developers, but it's very important for us as KMP team to know how Swift works or how iOS also works, right? Because ultimately, when you're writing that library, you're writing for both the platform. So until unless we are aware of the fact that how does Kotlin convert to Objective-C and then how Objective-C converts to Swift, until unless you know that transition, I don't think you will be able to do justice to both the platform, and you might lose the battle of convincing them as well. So I think it's very important for the Android team to understand how Swift or how this Objective-C world works, so that we can also make them more comfortable of adopting it as well. So definitely, I think it's a good habit again to have any KMP team to know how the iOS team or how the Swift actually works under the hood.
Mhm. Do you have any favorite resources that you like to suggest for like learning iOS, learning Swift?
I think the Apple website is also pretty good, the
Mhm.
swift.org. That's one way, the official recommendation. Other than that, I think you have Stanford courses now, you have Ray Wendelich. So yeah, Big Nerd. So yeah, we have a bunch of these websites that, I can share them later as well, and we can maybe link it to the notes if needed.
Sure. Yes.
Yeah.
I'm waiting for you to come out with a book, because you have so much experience here and a lot of knowledge. And before you do come out with a book, I do want to ask, do you have tips on writing Kotlin APIs that would result in a better experience for the iOS developers?
Um, so rather than let's say sharing those tips, I would rather uh, ask the Android team to always try to experiment how does a type translate to a type in Swift as well, before really architecting the entire thing, right? So let's say seal classes. They are very appealing, to manage states or to manage some enumerations, and but seal classes don't really translate really well to the iOS world. They are somehow, you have inheritance, you have nested objects, and then you have a lot of type checks at the end. And you have many more examples like this, like default arguments, they don't really work that well. the generics doesn't really work that powerful, because what I think what the KMP team needs to understand in any company is that how does Kotlin translate to objectives? Because we always think that Kotlin must be translating to Swift, but that's not the case. Even though we are using Swift now in most of the apps, but if you use KMP, then your Kotlin first converts to Objective-C and then it converts to Swift. So now this Objective-C to Swift is a bit tricky space. That's where a lot of types you might lose a lot of type information. There are a lot of things which are not so powerful in Objective-C, which are very powerful now in Swift. Like generics is one of them, protocols is one of them. There are so many things that now slowly, and a lot of new frameworks also coming only for Swift now. So I think it will be really nice to see that when we can have this direct interop of Kotlin to Swift. I think the moment we have that, the adoption rate would be really high. Like there will be a lot that should increase adoption a lot. So yeah, so there are a lot of, I think, and lately I've seen that a lot of folks are writing really good content on this topic as well, like how do you write idiomatic, how do you write Kotlin code which turns to idiomatic Swift. So I would also link those blog posts. They are really good to read about, and people are writing series as well now. So I think the community, I think, is really coming together, and we are really talking about the hard pieces now, which really matters, because everybody talks about the good parts of it, how to onboard people, but what about the hard part? Because once you use them, you have to maintain them as well, and maintenance is not easy. And if your types are losing, if you're losing on types and your information, then of course, like your iOS team won't feel that good. So yeah, like I think it's very important to experiment on how the type translates, and also keep an eye on some open source tool which can help that bridge the gap as well. So yeah, those were things.
I was going to bring this up at the end, but since we're talking about it, and you're right, more people are writing about this. There's already been some open source tooling that's trying to help with this boundary between the Kotlin and Swift. There's been Moco K Swift for a long time, and KMP native coroutines from Rick. And I do have an update on Touchlab's Swift Kotlin interface. So we are open sourcing it, and we've been developing for quite a long time. And you're exactly right that this is a major pain point for adoption. And this is something we've been talking to JetBrains about. And so by the time this episode airs, it should be open source. People should be able to look at that and start weighing their options on like what is the best solution for this challenge. So we're really excited about that.
Awesome. Yeah, definitely. I think we'll love to check it out.
Yeah, lovely. Congratulations and thank you.
Yeah.
So, Ritesh, as an iOS developer, do you think that everyone should contribute to KMP code, or just a few people that are sort of designated as KMP programmers?
I think for easier adoption, we should start with a small team, which are only doing KMP. And then once people get comfortable, with the process of how the entire stack works end to end, I think then slowly we should onboard other team members for sure. So I think it's a transition, or it's a phase that starts from a small team, a dedicated team, which slowly becomes, where you also involve a lot more developers towards the other phases of the adoption rate. So yeah, I think because initially, I think if we open the gate to everybody, then like I'm not sure if we'll have more, let's say, fight back of the approach, and it might be harder to explain to everybody as well, or convince everybody at the same time. So I think it's easier if we can adopt in a small team first, and then slowly ask the other folks that, hey, this is something that, and we can always find folks who are always interested in something, right? So once we start finding those developers, then we can just onboard them, and then once we start onboarding a couple of them, then that also builds confidence in the entire team as well, that hey, other folks are started joining the team as well, and maybe this is a good thing, and maybe we should also check it out. So I think it's more of a people game versus a tech game, when it comes to adoption of this.
Yeah, I like it. Good.
That's well said. I'm going to switch gears now because you're into design systems. I love great design on mobile, and I care a lot about it's going to feel right on iOS. It's going to feel right on Android or on web, on desktop, whatever you're doing. And Compose Multiplatform is going to be across all of those. It's actually working quite well across all of those right now. What are your views on native UI versus Compose Multiplatform?
So are you referring to the Compose for iOS that came out recently, right? Okay, yeah, cool. So yeah, I mean, I think um, for any app that like wants to scale, I think performance becomes a factor pretty soon for any company to measure their app, how well the app is performing, right? So I think before we jump to adopting any pattern or any framework, especially for the UI side of things, I think it's important that we factor in the performance side of those things. So before we adopt something, I think it'll be better to see if that is performant enough. We do profiling of the app, we benchmark, we see the bottlenecks, and I think once we are comfortable with those numbers, probably then I think definitely I think any framework should be adaptable, right? Like if it's performant enough, what's the harm, right? Ultimately, what we need is to give 60 FPS to users, or maybe even more in the future. Right? So as far as any platform is able to achieve that without any bottlenecks, without any problem, I think that should be a sellable framework to any company, right? Uh, but I think for anything which is new, I would always start small. So just like for Compose for iOS, I would first start with one of my smallest screens, maybe, or maybe smallest, something which is not very, which doesn't need too much performance, So maybe I'll start with a small view or a small section of my app, which is fine if it's not performing too well as well, because it doesn't need, let's say, a lot of scrolling or a lot of content to watch, Now, so I think we need to pick the right tool at the right time, as well. So yeah, like I mean, it's very exciting in the first place that we are able to share a lot more than just not just the business logic, but the UI as well, and that using Compose, which is also declarative programming of writing of UI. And wherever we have a promise, there's always a trade-off that comes with that as well. So the more Compose that we write, which is shareable across all the platform, the less we'll write let's say less Swift UI or less UI kit code as well. So now is that Compose for iOS performant enough that it can replace a table view or a collection view in iOS, right? So those are the real questions that as a team we should ask. And if our analysis says that yes, they are compatible, then yes, why not? We would love to transition that to that Compose for iOS. But otherwise, I think because even in Swift UI, there are a lot of components which are not really well sharpened right now, and even the ideal way of right now to use Swift UI is a mix of Swift UI and UI Kit, and I think that might be true for iOS for Android as well. Maybe Compose also not stable for a lot of components. Maybe they also have some performance issues. So I think it will be. I think it's important to understand their what will the impact of that change, and if it's good enough, then I think it's fine. Otherwise, I think we should have a balance of both the worlds.
Yeah, there's something. A lot of people will say like, "Is it ready?" They'll ask, "Is it ready for production?" And the thing is, there's people who put stuff into production that the majority of people don't think is ready for production, but they did think it was ready. So it really is about testing it, seeing it on the small, like, is this going to work for us? And are we ready to maintain something that's early and keep up with the changes? Because, people like Kareem were using Kotlin Multiplatform in 2018, maybe even before that. And then there's companies that are already using Compose on iOS in production, which is a big surprise, but also not really surprising because there's early adopters.
Yeah.
You have open sourced a bunch of things, reusable components for iOS. It's been a while since I've seen you do something. Do you have plans to do more with open source?
I think so. I think there comes a phase, with any developer that, like, for a couple of years, you are passionate about something, and I think at that time I was really passionate about those reusable components of iOS side of things, and that led to a lot of these side projects and a lot of libraries. So yeah, I think KMP is something which I've been meaning to write about it as well. So but haven't really got that, let's say I need maybe more use cases or more challenges, that I can maybe sum it up and then maybe talk about it more. But it's something which I've been failing to do. So maybe, being lazy or whatever. But yeah, like, I think would love to get back to that zone again where I can start contributing. And there are, of course, bunch of topics that I would love to talk about. But there's nothing as such on my mind where I would like to open source like straight away, because I've transitioned from like from an iOS team to more like a platform team now. So in the last couple of years, I've been focusing more on platform specific work, which, let's say, benefits multiple platforms. So I'm not really, so maybe about that as well. So I'm in the learning phase again in my life, where I'm learning more about platform related changes or platform challenges that a company will face, because mobile DevOps was never a thing, but slowly it is getting real traction now, right? It's we have more CI/CDs now, we have more automations now, so we need that space. So this space very new for a mobile platform, and I think that's where I'm again learning from scratch how these things work, and maybe, yeah, maybe I'll write about it, or maybe I'll share something about it in coming future. But yeah, no plans as of now. But yes, would love to come back to it again. Like, yeah.
No pressure, but we'd love to read your articles and things. Speaking about articles, what resource contributors like articles, video tutorials, blogs, samples would you like to give a shout out to for helping you solve problems with your KMP code?
I think so. The primary sources that I've been looking forward to or interacting is, of course, one of them in Touchlab. I think their work is amazing. They have really kickstarted and speared all of us and gave us direction. I still remember, I had a chat with Kevin way back in 2019 in Redmond, New York, and he really motivated me to give it a shot, and how I can, as an iOS developer, adopt to it. So I think TouchLab indirectly has been a very supporting in that case. Apart from that, I think Kotlin Slack is a great way to ask your questions. It's full of resources, and people are so helpful there. So just go on and ask your doubt there. At that time, we didn't have too many channels, but now I think we have abundant channels as well. So I think Kotlin Slack, I would mention, definitely go to there. And then apart from that, there are other folks like, on Twitter as well, which I'll also share at the end, that, I mean, and lately a lot of folks are writing blogs as well about it. Like, I think recently I read I think a 5-part series of how to write, better KMP code in iOS. So I think there's a lot more content now, and I think all of them are really, really good now. But yeah, like, I think these are the primary ones. And of course, I think I have also gained a lot from like random GitHub repos, and then stumbling upon their issue section, and then finding some conversation here and there as well. So searching Tiger on GitHub also helps sometimes. I remember there was a problem I was stuck on, which was around multipart, like, so for some reason multipart was not working with KMP at that time, and it was not KMP problem, it was my, like, the code was not correct written. But that was not mentioned anywhere, like in none of the KTOR docs I could find. But then some random GitHub repo had a comment section, somebody was discussing some issue there, and I was able to figure out, hey, I'm missing this argument, maybe let's try this out, and that actually worked out. So yeah, I mean, these are the various things that might help.
Yeah, especially seeing actual code on GitHub that people are working with, and maybe we can have some kind of campaign where people who are interested in Kotlin Multiplatform start starring the KMP open source stuff, even if they're like little sample apps, like somebody did something interesting over here. We can get more visibility there, because all of it is useful, even if you're like, oh, I wouldn't do it that way, but now you have a better understanding of what other people are doing and you've thought about it. you mentioned Kotlin Lang, and I just had to check because I know it has been growing, and the multi-platform channel there now has over 7,000 people.
Amazing.
This is I did not expect that.
Yeah.
Moving on to our last question. Where can folks catch you speaking next?
So no immediate conference as of now. I did apply to, so my talk got selected to TradCon Berlin and Droid Kaigi, but because of the visa issues, I couldn't really go there and speak there. But let's hope. But I'm hopeful that maybe some other TradCon or some other IS conference will accept the talk as well. But yeah, like no immediate conference as of now for me.
I'm sorry, that
Well,
really
we hope to
sucks.
see. Yeah, keep
Yeah,
filling out
that's
those.
why.
hope to see you soon.
Yeah, keep filling out those CFPs, and the visa stuff will get sorted out, and we'll be really happy to see you there.
Yeah, definitely.
Definitely. And with that, folks, that's the end of our episode. Thank you so much to Ritesh for being our amazing guest for the day. And thank you to my co-host, Justin, for being amazing as always. And thank you to everyone listening. You are superstars. Have a great day further, and bye-bye.
Yeah, thanks,
Bye, everyone.
Pamela. Thanks, Justin, for having me. I think it was a pleasure talking to you guys.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
Ritesh.
Oh, so glad. Thank you. Bye,
Thank you.
everyone.
Bye.